Hey there everyone, this is Robert with Reading Through History, and today we're going to be discussing the topic everyone's been patiently waiting for, and that is the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now also in this lesson we're going to be looking at Angel Island, and I'm trying a little bit of a different format just to kind of keep you on your toes, keep you interested. Oh yes, because I know you've been waiting for this one. Now this isn't exactly a fun topic. It's never easy to kind of look back on stuff like this in our history, but we have to acknowledge it, and that's kind of what we're doing here. So this one's going to be called Angel Island and the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, first we need to deal with Chinese immigration. Now they've been coming in really since the California Gold Rush, or I should say the years following the California Gold Rush, because the lure of riches and stuff in California is really going to draw them here in big numbers. Now we're talking about 1851, 1852 here, so kind of Old West out on the California coast. And of course the East Coast is going to be obsessed with the slavery issue and the Compromise of 1850 and the fugitive slave laws and stuff leading up to the Civil War. So these were kind of like two separate Americas. You know, the Transcontinental Railroad hadn't been completed yet. And it's estimated that from about 1851 to 1883, 300,000 Chinese immigrated into the United States. As I said, they come in a little late to get in on the riches of the California Gold Rush, but they really start settling in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the Chinese population on the West Coast is going to continue to grow. Now the real contribution that you of course cannot escape if you look at any U.S. history textbook that covers this era is their help in constructing the Transcontinental Railroad. Now the Irish are going to migrate in from the East Coast. They're going to start building the railroads westward. The Chinese are going to start providing that cheap labor that I believe it was the Trans-Pacific Railroad Company or the Union Pacific Railroad Company out there really loved this cheap labor. Now it's always interesting to look at how they built the Transcontinental Railroad. I mean, they really had a tough time blasting their way through the Rocky Mountains. And of course it's going to be the Chinese laborers who are going to get stuck doing this. They always had the most dangerous jobs. If you needed to scale someone down the side of the mountain and, you know, plant dynamite in the side of this rocky cliff, they would use the Chinese. And you may or may not get pulled up in time to escape the blast, but even dynamite wasn't good enough, so they had to literally start mixing chemicals and stuff on site, like nitroglycerin. And the guys who concocted these schemes got the highest pay of all, and they even got hazard pay. I mean the equivalent of thousands of dollars a month in some cases to concoct this stuff. But then of course they would give it to the Chinese immigrants who received just unbearably low pay, and got them to actually go down inside the holes they had dug in the side of these mountains and set this stuff off. And the progress that the Chinese migrants made blasting their way through the mountains is pretty impressive. And of course a lot of them died in explosions, a lot of them died in rock slides, a lot of them basically were worked to death, and no one seemed to particularly care for, you know, the well-being of these Chinese migrants. Now on to the Japanese. The Japanese, they kind of have an interesting story. In 1884, before the United States of America annexed Hawaii, Japanese had been invited to Hawaii to provide the physical labor in the fields. So when the United States of America in 1898 comes along, we're like, hey, this is ours. It kind of starts this boom of Japanese migrants coming into the United States, because now it was a U.S. territory. And this really wasn't happening in very large numbers prior to the annexation of Hawaii, but it's really going to start picking up. And by 1920, it is estimated that there were 200,000 Japanese living on the west coast of the United States. Again, we're predominantly talking about California here. Now, something that has to be mentioned when you're talking about this immigration from Asia to the United States, you have to mention Angel Island. Now in the next video we're going to discuss Ellis Island. That's the one on the East Coast. Angel Island on the West Coast. Just kind of think of the California Angels, and that'll keep you from getting these two things mixed up. But the Asian immigrants had to come through what is known as Angel Island. And this picture here shows a young Japanese male being interrogated. And that's basically what they did. They subjected them to very long, strenuous questioning because, as I said in the previous video, they really didn't think they could trust these Asian immigrants. And the guy down there in the back of the picture with the creepy mustache, I mean, you know what I'm thinking about. This is kind of weird, kind of Adolf Hitler Führer looking, maybe some kind of an imposter, maybe, well, I'm not even going to go there. But this whole mustache was pretty common, the mid-tuft mustache was pretty common in this area till Hitler ruined it. Dang you, Hitler. But they came in through here. Most of these were Chinese. Now this number here is very interesting because it says, I got this straight out of the textbook, 50,000 Chinese immigrants came through Angel Island between 1910 and 1940. Now this is really weird because the law we're going to talk about later, the Chinese Exclusion Act, would have been in effect at this time. But we're kind of going to see there were a few ways around this. It wasn't a complete and total ban on Chinese immigration, but 50,000 over 30 years doesn't sound like a lot, and it wasn't because they were heavily restricted. So Angel Island was in San Francisco Bay, California. You would come in on the boat, you would land there, and you'd immediately be sent to these processing facilities. And inside these processing facilities, very harsh questioning, as I said, and the living conditions there were terrible. I mean, these places were filthy. They were disgusting. It's not like they made any kind of an effort to make, the living conditions in here even suitable for human beings at all. And you could be held for a very long time. And there was no promise you were getting in. And of course, if you sat there for months going through all this questioning, then they said no, you had to be put back on the boats and shipped back to China or Japan or wherever it was that you were coming from. So this whole process could take years, and you may not even actually get in. Now, life for the Chinese immigrants was very tough. I mentioned in the last video, culturally they were different. They were different in appearance from the mainstream Americans and the European immigrants. The problems with people not trusting them because they weren't from a Christian background. And the discrimination that they faced, even if you got in and got through, was pretty harsh. I mean, there were tons and tons of cartoons like the one down below. Now, the look that you see in this is kind of unique. I mean, this is quintessentially Chinese. This is what many of the men from China look like. They would shave their head with the top knot, and you can see the clothing attire and stuff. And I found tons and tons of pictures from like riots in Wyoming of all places. And apparently it got pretty intense out there. There were lots of attacks on villages that had been established by these Chinese immigrants, and the places were looted and burned and robbed, and the people were chased off. Lots of fighting and death going on in these. And of course these immigrants tended to, like immigrants often do, settle together in immigrant communities, oftentimes because it just felt more comfortable and because it was safer. Remember, these people couldn't speak English when they got here, so that would be very tough. Many of them were uneducated, and even if you were educated and you couldn't communicate, with the mainstream populace, this is going to create a lot of problems and friction. So they tended to publish their own newspapers in their native languages. If it's in a city, you're going to get the Chinatowns that are going to develop, where these immigrants will tend to stick together in one group. But the conflict, it's going to be there. I talked about nativism in the last video. This distrust, it flowed both ways, but you have to remember, the host country, if these people don't assimilate really quickly, it's going to start causing issues. So this anti-Asian sentiment was very harsh. And of course they feared that the Chinese immigrants were going to, oh, they're bringing down the wages, oh, they're criminals, they're not like us, they don't look like us, they have, funny religions and so on and so forth. And then you're going to get the economic depression. Now, countries are always way more open to immigration when the economic times are good. I mean, when it's booming, the business owners, the employers, they want the cheap labor. They like the cheap labor. Now, the labor movement during this era was very anti-immigrant because they were like, oh, they're hurting us. They're driving down the wages. And they would do jobs that, mainstream Americans typically would not want to do or feel a need to. But when the economic depression hits, and the one in 1873 was big. I mean, this was a big, big recession. Might as well go ahead and just call it a depression. I mean, banks were closing, people were losing their jobs. And of course, when you lose your jobs and there's not many jobs available, you start looking at the jobs that the Chinese immigrants are doing, and you start saying, hey, I can't find a job, and it's because of these guys. And they don't ask for very much money, so we need to get rid of them. So this sentiment is going to start growing. And as I said, the labor groups were always criticizing the Asian immigrants. And they were publishing newspapers and cartoons and stories and traveling around giving speeches. We got to get rid of the Chinese. We got to get rid of the Chinese. We have got to get rid of the Chinese. And that's what they were always saying. That's what they were always preaching. And you look at some of these cartoons, I mean, the first blow, we got to punch him in the face. And it's always this caricature. I said, pay really close attention to the caricature of the Chinese immigrant, and you can kind of see a pattern forming very, very quickly. So this sentiment's going to grow, and there's this Dennis Kearney. Now this is in California, and I want you to remember all this happened in California on the West Coast. The liberal progressive California during this era wasn't so accepting or liberal or progressive. He started this group called the Working Man's Party, and he traveled around giving these impassioned speeches, about, oh, our culture is under threat, these Chinese immigrants they're the cause of every problem we have, befalling society. And he would end the speech by saying, the Chinese must go, the Chinese must go. So yeah, not a very, loving, accepting attitude, but this reflected the sentiment of most of the mainstream population out there, and they really wanted something done about this Chinese immigration. And remember, if this stuff hadn't have happened, and if Congress hadn't reacted, the cultural landscape of the West Coast would be very different today, because they're going to take a pretty substantial group of immigrants who are coming in, and they're just going to throw a wall up and say, no more, no mas, we're not letting them in. So by 1882, Congress, they're like, yeah, this is getting pretty big and bad. We got to, the noise level was so high, they're like, we've got to do something. So they get together and they start concocting a plan, a scheme, a law, and they're going to pass it, and it's going to go into effect, and it's called the Chinese Exclusion Act. This law is kind of amazing, because what they did is they said, hey, here we got this group of people that's coming in. The folks out west really don't like them. Apparently this is a big, huge problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a ban on them. No more people from this country. Just throw up a stone wall. And this law prohibited Chinese immigration for 10 years. But that's not going to be enough, because the 10 years are going to come and go, and they're going to say, well, we still need this law. And they're going to renew it again for 20 years. Let's go 20. And that's going to expire. And they go, no, let's go 10 more. And then they're going to say, no, 10 more isn't enough. We're going to do it indefinitely. We're just going to stop Chinese immigration cold into the United States. Now, they did make a few exceptions, because if 50,000 people got through in 30 years, every law's got an exception. Everyone has a way around it. And politicians write them these ways, and even if they didn't, lawyers and other people, they're going to find a way around it. They said, well, maybe not all Chinese are bad. Tourists come here and spend money. Yeah, we like that. Come look at our stuff and give us your money. Just make sure you leave after you leave your cash here. Students, well, they can come and study. And who wouldn't want to go study in a country where seemingly the people there hate you and your culture and everything about you. But, education is an education. Teachers, well, we need teachers to come in. I'm not sure really what kind of teachers these were. I mean, are these teachers that are going to come in and teach in the universities? Or these, people to help with language with the Chinese who are already here? Assimilation? That's pretty broad. Teachers. Merchants. Now, why would they like merchants? Again, money. If they're going to come over here and sell stuff and do business, bring us a profit, we're all for the merchants. Money, throw money into the equation and it'll change. If they're going to spend and throw money around, it's much different than if they're going to come here and work for almost nothing. Government officials, well, you can't exactly exclude the Chinese government officials. That would be kind of crass and tacky, but I guess we have to let them in. So this is kind of the sentiment that's flowing through this law. Yeah, I mean, this is it's a very obviously discriminatory law. And like I said, they're going to extend it. They pass it, renew it, extend it. And this law is going to stay in effect until 1943. I want you to realize 1943, what's going on? We're at war with Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan. And one of our allies that people never mention, they always forget whenever you're running down the list of the allies, China. I mean, China was fighting Japan before we were. And it's kind of weird because this law is going to be extended later to the Japanese. We just kind of cluster them together and say China and Japan, we don't want them, keep them out. And World War II starts and we're sitting here fighting this thing and it turns out China's on our side. Now, I'm not sure how much that had to do with this or if it's just we needed more labor. But during 1943, it's not like a lot of people were getting on boats and floating across the Pacific Ocean considering there was a war going on out there. I mean, hello, Battle of Midway, we're just streaming right on along, just never mind us, we're just going to America. I'm sure the Japanese would just, bypass you and all of this stuff, but that was going on. Technically, I guess this was about a year after Midway, but you catch my drift. There was a lot of fighting going on and submarine warfare, and they didn't particularly care who was on that boat or where it was going. If it wasn't theirs, torpedo. So, this Japanese sentiment, this hatred of the Japanese immigrant, it's going to kind of come in on the heels of the Chinese. Like I said, Americans, even still to this day, have a tendency to clump these two groups together. It's kind of like saying the French and the Germans are the same. But, that's what we do because we're Americans and most of us don't honestly know any better. But by the early 1900s, people were very anti-Japanese. I mean, they were like, oh, they're just keeping out the Chinese, but aren't doing anything about these Japanese. So they're going to turn to the government and say, hey, there's like Japanese people running around everywhere. And you can, again, see the characters. I don't know if you paid attention, in that last one with Uncle Sam holding the door there. They just portrayed the Chinese as these little slimy people that could just come in through the crevices and crooks, and he's trying to hold the door and they're coming up through the floor and everything. So Americans are just, you got to do something, man, because they're still coming in. So what happens in 1906, this anti-Japanese sentiment gets so bad, San Francisco, yes, this is San Francisco. And good grief, this be right around the time of the big earthquake in San Francisco. They threw up this new policy, we don't want the Japanese kids going to school with our kids. So people give these southern states a hard time, oh, you segregated your schools and kept the black and white kids separate, but San Francisco, 1906. Separate schools for Japanese students. So we're just going to make them go to their own school. We don't want them going to school with us. We're Americans. Well, what happens is the Japanese government, when they hear about this, they're deeply insulted and they're like, dude, seriously? Separate schools for the Japanese? I thought this was the land of the free and the home of the brave and everyone was equal and all this stuff. And remember, most of these kids by this point would have been American citizens. And they're like, oh yeah, we got separate schools. So Teddy Roosevelt's going to come along and they're going to say, dude, what's up, He's like, oh yeah, about that. Well, the American people are just really fed up with these unskilled Japanese workers coming into the country. And it sounds so weird. You think of Japanese workers now, the last thing you think of is unskilled. But at the time, Japan wasn't developed. Many of these people were poor. That's why they were leaving. So they were coming over here looking for opportunity. And he's like, I'll tell you what, why don't we make an agreement? This is called the Gentleman's Agreement. Now this can get kind of confusing because there are a lot of Gentlemen's Agreement. But this one is known by that name. And what they do is they say, okay, Japan, if you will limit the immigration, that is people leaving your country, if you'll limit the immigration of unskilled workers from your country to ours, I will step in and make them integrate the schools. You know, I'll put on the pressure, and Teddy Roosevelt could put on the pressure, as you'll see in later videos. This was a man who knew how to get his way, and that's what Japan does. Japan basically says, okay, we'll limit the number of poor, unskilled workers leaving our country, and you get rid of that. So that is kind of the story of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and as I said, many parts of that law were later extended to the Japanese, and the Gentleman's Agreement, and of course Angel Island. So you should by this point be fairly comfortable with all three of those things and what they were. If you found this video useful, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share, do all of that stuff. We're doing an entire series on this, and we're just going to march right on through U.S. history and the objectives of everything you need to know to pass the U.S. History End of Instruction exam. So, till next time, sayonara.